In 1917, during World War I, Germany and France were fighting over a small strip of land at the border. The battle was for just a few hundred meters of land, but it cost the lives of many young soldiers. Before burying the German soldiers who had died, their uniforms, shoes, and helmets were removed. These items were sent to a special laundry, cleaned, and sewn into new uniforms for the next group of soldiers preparing for war. In North Germany, 4 teenagers named Paul, Albert, Ludwig, and Franz arrived at their school. Paul told his friends that his mother didn't want him to join the army. At that time, German schools allowed teenagers to enlist in the army if their parents approved. Paul's friends teased him, and Franz suggested that Paul forge his mother's approval letter so they could all enlist together. At school, before turning in their approval letters, the principal gave a motivational speech to encourage the students heading to war. The students smiled innocently, showing no fear, unaware of the horrors waiting for them on the battlefield. Their reason for going to war wasn't about patriotism. They wanted to look brave and cool in front of others. Once they received their uniforms, the 4 friends, along with many other young soldiers, headed to the battlefield, not knowing they might never smile again. When they arrived at the camp, a doctor stopped their truck and ordered the soldiers to get off, so the vehicle could be used to transport wounded soldiers to the hospital. The group then walked for many kilometers. Suddenly, they were caught in a bombing attack. The commander told everyone to put on gas masks, but Paul was slow to follow instructions. As punishment, he had to keep wearing his gas mask without taking it off until they reached the base. At the base, they met the vice commander, Stanislaus Kaczynski, Kat. Unlike the strict commander, Kat was kind and approachable. That night, the enemy was still nowhere to be seen. While Paul and Albert were on guard duty, they heard footsteps approaching. Surprisingly, instead of being alert, Paul felt happy. Feeling excited, Paul thought this was his chance to show off his shooting skills in front of Albert. Unfortunately, he missed his target, which alerted the enemy. They retaliated, and a bullet struck Paul's helmet, shocking him. As the enemy launched a sudden attack, the commander ordered everyone to take cover. Hiding in a shelter, the soldiers remained silent as Kat explained that these night attacks were common. Enemy soldiers would sneak closer to the base and attack any unguarded areas. Since their artillery wasn't advanced enough to fight back, they could only wait for the attack to end. During the tense situation, a frightened soldier regretted joining the war and begged to go home. Suddenly, the base was heavily attacked, throwing everything into chaos. The soldiers ran to save themselves, but the attack destroyed the base, burying Paul and many others under the rubble. The next day, Paul was rescued by Albert and the other soldiers. Still in shock, Paul couldn't believe how traumatizing the war was. While resting, Kat gave him bread to help him recover. Soon after, the commander ordered everyone to collect the identification necklaces from the fallen soldiers. The necklaces carried names and addresses to inform their families. As Paul collected necklaces, he accidentally stepped on Ludwig's glasses. Panicking, he searched for his friend and was horrified to find Ludwig's lifeless body among the corpses. Though heartbroken, Paul realized there was no time to mourn. He stood up and continued collecting necklaces, now fully aware that his nightmare had just begun. 1 year later, Paul had adapted to the horrors of war. One day while walking with Kat, they discovered a small farm near the forest. Hungry for a decent meal, they decided to steal livestock. Kat went into the farm while Paul stood guard outside. After a while, a gunshot rang out. The farmer had caught Kat stealing a goose and tried to shoot him. Thankfully, they managed to escape and return to the base safely. Back at the base, Kat called Paul, Albert, Franz, and a soldier named Jaden to enjoy the goose he had cooked. They were all very happy, as if it was their first time tasting good food. During the meal, they laughed and joked, trying to comfort each other and forget the horrors of the endless war. The next day, while peeling potatoes, the 5 soldiers saw 3 women passing by. Since it had been a long time since they had seen or spoken to a woman, they were enchanted. Among them, only Franz dared to approach the women and escort them home. Watching Franz's bravery, Albert felt jealous. That afternoon, while Paul was writing a letter to his family, Kat approached him, asking for help reading a letter from his wife. In the letter, Kat's wife wrote about how much she missed him and how she longed for him to return so they could visit their child's grave together. After hearing this, Kat shared his feelings with Paul. He felt like he had failed as a father because he wasn't there when his child was sick, or even at the time of their passing. He had been away at war. He expressed his frustration about how no one wanted to be at war, but they were all trapped by government promises of high pay. In reality, their salaries were much lower than expected, barely enough to survive. Meanwhile, the high-ranking generals stayed far from danger, only giving orders. Listening to Kat's story, Paul began to understand how deeply Kat resented the war. That evening, when they returned to camp, Franz shared a story about the girls he escorted home earlier. He showed the group a handkerchief one of the girls gave him as a gift. Franz jokingly told Paul to sniff the handkerchief so that if they lost the war, at least Paul would know what a woman's scent was like. Laughing, Paul sniffed it. The next day, Paul, Albert, Franz, Kat, and Jaden were ordered to search for 60 missing soldiers who had vanished after a French attack near an abandoned railroad. While searching, Kat noticed a faint trace of poisonous gas used by the French. He was certain that if the soldiers had survived, they would have sought shelter nearby. The group entered a nearby warehouse and split up to search. When Paul entered one of the rooms, he was horrified to see the 60 soldiers lying dead on the floor. He screamed to call his friends. When Kat saw the bodies, he realized that the soldiers had died from inhaling a fatal dose of poisonous gas. That night at the German base, the German war general was furious. He was upset that the government wanted to surrender to France and begged for peace. Despite Germany's lack of tanks and advanced combat equipment, the general believed his troops could still win the war. Viewing peace as a sign of weakness, he ordered his assistants to prepare for a major attack the next day. The following morning, German and French delegates met on a train. One German delegate, Matthias, pleaded with the French to stop their tanks from attacking, as Germany had already lost too many soldiers. The French delegates handed over a folder of agreements that Germany needed to sign. They gave Germany 72 hours to decide, and until the agreement was signed, the war would continue. On the battlefield, German soldiers prepared for another attack, but their spirits were low. Deep down, they were tired of the endless war and longed to return home to their families. When the attack began, the soldiers fought without enthusiasm. Midway through the battle, French tanks arrived, breaking through the German formations. Despite their limited and makeshift weapons, the Germans fought back, but their bullets barely damaged the tanks. The French tanks crushed German defenses, forcing the soldiers to flee. The French soldiers joined the attack, armed with more advanced weapons, including flamethrowers. They used them to burn alive any remaining German soldiers. Amid the chaos, Paul witnessed his friend Albert being burned alive by French soldiers. Terrified, Paul ran back to the trench. The commander, showing no sympathy, ordered Paul to carry as much ammunition as possible. There was no time to grieve. After gathering the ammunition, Paul ran to escape. Exhausted and burdened by the heavy load, he tripped over a rock and fell into a hole. Fearing he would be discovered by an enemy soldier, he pretended to be dead. Suddenly, a French soldier appeared above him, aiming his gun. Just as the soldier was about to shoot, another German soldier killed the Frenchman. The French soldier fell into the hole, giving Paul a chance to strike. Grabbing a knife, Paul stabbed the soldier repeatedly. As the French soldier lay dying, Paul was overcome with regret. He realized the weight of his actions and began to feel deep remorse for taking the soldier's life. Without realizing it, the war had turned Paul into a heartless killer. When he checked the French soldier's identification, he discovered that the man he had just killed was just like him, a soldier with a family who was caught up in this senseless war. Overcome with guilt, Paul kept apologizing for his actions, even though it wouldn't change anything. Meanwhile, on the train where the negotiations were taking place, the German delegates protested against the terms proposed by France. They felt the agreement was unfair and humiliated Germany, making it seem as though they were surrendering completely. Some argued that it would be better to cancel the ceasefire and continue fighting, even if it meant losing, so Germany could retain its honor and intimidate other countries. However, Matthias reminded them that this wasn't about pride or power, but about saving the lives of thousands of young German soldiers still fighting on the battlefield, even though they had no chance of winning. After much debate, the German and French delegations met again. In front of the French, Matthias and two other German delegates signed the agreement, promising that Germany would do its best to meet France's conditions. The French then announced that the war would officially end the next day, on November 11th at exactly 11 a.m. The long battle between Germany and France would finally be over. Back at the camp, Paul noticed soldiers cheering and congratulating each other. Confused, he asked what was going on. A fellow soldier explained that the government had announced the war would end the next day at 11. Soon they would be able to return home and reunite with their families. Paul was overjoyed but felt an urgent need to find his remaining friends. He went to the treatment area, where many wounded soldiers lay in pain, waiting for help. Among them, he found Jaden. Sadly, Jaden told him that his leg was so severely injured that the doctors had to amputate it. Jaden then gave Paul Franz's handkerchief and told him the devastating news that Franz had died in the recent battle. Once again, Paul had lost one of his best friends. Jaden encouraged him not to be sad and reminded him to be grateful. Unlike Jaden, Paul had survived the war without injury or disability. As Jaden calmed down, Paul left to find food. On his way to the kitchen, still mourning his friend's death, Paul tied Franz's handkerchief around his neck as a tribute to his fallen friend. When Paul arrived at the kitchen, he saw a chaotic scene with everyone yelling for food. Amid the crowd, he spotted Kat and felt relieved to see him alive. After they both managed to get a bit of potato soup, they went to Jaden's place and encouraged him to eat. However, before eating, Jaden asked for a fork and spoon, not to eat but to stab himself in the neck. As he lay dying, Jaden said he would rather die than live as a disabled person. Paul and Kat stood silently, unable to do anything but watch their friend take his own life. Meanwhile, the German war general and his assistants were feasting on luxurious meals, a stark contrast to the soldiers who fought over scraps of potato soup. The general expressed his frustration with the government's decision to surrender to France. He believed there were still plenty of young Germans willing to fight. He ordered his assistants to gather all the soldiers in the yard the next afternoon. The next day, when Paul woke up, he found Kat staring outside. Kat said it was the most beautiful day since the war began. For the first time in 4 years, there wasn't a single sound of gunfire. To celebrate, they decided to go for a walk. Along the way, Kat shared his excitement about going home. He couldn't wait to hug and kiss his wife. He also advised Paul to continue his studies and work toward becoming a great person in the future. During their walk, they passed the farm where they had stolen a goose before. Jokingly, Kat suggested they steal again before going home. Laughing, Paul agreed. This time, it was Paul's turn to go inside while Kat kept watch. Inside, Paul saw that the geese were still too young, so he decided to steal eggs instead. However, they were caught by the farmer and his son, who tried to shoot them. Luckily, they managed to escape. On the way back, Paul accidentally broke one of the eggs he was carrying. They quickly collected the spilled eggs and took turns drinking them. Later, as Kat went to relieve himself in the forest, the farmer's son appeared, pointing a gun at him. Paul suddenly heard a gunshot and rushed to check. At first, he saw Kat walking and thought he was fine, but then Kat collapsed. Paul realized Kat had been shot in the left side of his stomach. Panicked, Paul carried him back to the camp as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, when the doctor examined Kat, he said there was nothing he could do to save him. Hearing this, Paul was devastated. All his friends were now gone, leaving him completely alone. Having witnessed all his friends die one by one before his eyes, Paul was left alone, lost in thought. Suddenly, the general's assistant arrived, ordering all the soldiers to gather in the courtyard. Once gathered, the general announced that they would soon be going home. However, before that, he commanded them to return to the battlefield one last time to seize the border. He declared that the war wasn't over until the clock struck 11. He didn't care if the final fight cost the lives of thousands of his soldiers. What mattered to him was that Germany reclaimed the land. Hearing this, the soldiers were enraged, but had no choice but to obey. Those who refused or tried to flee were executed on the spot. As they marched toward the battlefield, Paul asked a young soldier next to him for the time. The soldier replied that it was 10:45, a mere 15 minutes before 11, when the war would officially end. All the soldiers could think about was staying alive until then. When the attack began, Paul saw the young soldier being attacked by a French soldier and rushed to help him. Both of them fell into a French bunker. For a brief moment, they stopped, looking at each other and silently hoping the clock would move faster. Just as peace seemed within reach, another French soldier appeared and stabbed Paul through the heart. A few seconds later, the clock struck 11, marking the official end of the war. The commander's voice rang out, ordering all soldiers to cease fighting. As Paul lay dying, he felt immense sadness that his life had to end in the war's final seconds. Using his last bit of strength, Paul slowly crawled out of the bunker. Outside, he breathed in the air of peace. The sounds of gunfire, explosions, and war cries had vanished. The war had finally ended. Elsewhere, the German general stood silently, listening to the clock strike 11. He wasn't mourning his fallen troops, but was disappointed that Germany had failed to reclaim the land. Later, the assistant general arrived at the battlefield and ordered the soldiers, including the young man Paul had saved, to collect the identification necklaces of the fallen. One by one, the young soldier gathered necklaces until his footsteps halted. Before him lay the body of the man who had saved him, Paul, sitting lifeless in front of the bunker. Paul had joined his friends in death, finally free from the cruelty of war. As a final tribute, the young soldier saluted Paul, took his handkerchief, and tied it around his neck.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.